Quiz on Friday. I am making it online. All right, so it'll be a 10-minute timed online quiz. You will have until midnight on Friday to complete it. I will make it open after class on Friday. All right. I am going to say that if you want to use your notes, feel free to use your notes on this one. All right. This should be a nice gimme quiz. It should bump up your points a little bit. Remember, I do drop those 2 lowest quiz grades throughout the year. One other thing that I decided to do is I have posted on Moodle some potential short essay final exam questions. All right, so I believe there's 12 of them. They cover mostly comprehensive material. 2 of them will be on the exam for sure. All right, so because I'm giving you the questions ahead of time, when they show up on the exam, I expect pretty thorough answers. All right, so you should have some time to go through these. I did put on here that parts of these questions may show up in other parts of the exam. All right, so when I'm thinking about the comprehensive part, I'm probably going to be pulling off of this sheet more often than not. All right, I can't guarantee 100% of it will be off of this, but more often than not, the points for the comprehensive will come from here. Any questions on that? All right, I figured it might make your lives a little easier, kind of direct your studying a little bit there. Let's see. So we left off with that group worksheet that I handed out on Monday. And basically, I want you to get just a few things out of that worksheet. All right, I probably won't have you do the math on the exam. And if I do, it would be super easy. I would give you the equations. I would tell you exactly what to do. But really, I want to focus on that R0. All right, so I'll give you time to pull out that worksheet. But who can tell me what R0 is?
The beginning.
It was at the beginning, yes. The net reproductive rate, yeah. So that's where we added up the sum of all LX, MX in that column to get the R0, to get the net reproductive rate. All right, so how can we look at the net reproductive rate to look at population growth? What kind of equations did we look at? What did we do? What did we try to find out?
We added the survivorship rate to the fertility. Or like that. We added all the LX and MX values.
Yeah, so we added all those up to get the net reproductive rate. But then we also used net reproductive rate to figure out something else that was going on with our population. What was that? Not quite.
If the population is growing or declining based on it's greater than 1.
Yeah, so we can look and see if the population is declining or increasing. We can also use the net reproductive rate to look at population size in the future. All right, so we did that equation where nt plus 1 equals ntr0. All right, we're looking into the future using our net reproductive rate. All right, so looking kind of at that life table that we used, how can we analyze populations? We kind of just answered that. All right, we can look at populations into the future. We can look at their reproductive rate. We can look at their survivability. All right, so life tables, super handy. All right, now the information on that handout that I gave you, all right, I do expect you to know at least how to interpret the net reproductive rate number. All right, is the population increasing, declining, staying the same? Now, one thing you did also calculate on that worksheet was this lambda value. All right, so that was that finite rate of increase. And we also use that to look at a population in time. All right, so I just kind of wanted to throw up there, what is the difference between the net reproductive rate and the finite rate of increase? Well, if we're looking at a species that only lives and breeds for 1 year, so let's say they're an annual plant, they're the same thing. They mean exactly the same thing. All right, but when we're looking at multiple generations, this is where they differ. All right, the net reproductive rate only looks at a single generation, where the finite rate of increase can look at multiple generations or a change over some time interval. Maybe we're looking at 5 years into the future or 7 years into the future. Right? And we would interpret that lambda value the same way we would the net reproductive rate. All right, so that was a lot of math, and again, I don't expect you to memorize those equations, but let's continue looking at our population ecology. All right, so if we're looking at population ecology, we're looking at the changes in size and the factors that might regulate these populations. And these factors will include births, deaths, immigration, and immigration. Right? We might be immigrating to an area, we might have individuals leaving the populations and emigrating somewhere else. All right, so there's a lot of factors that can affect population size beyond demography, and I just wanted to throw this out here. That we can look at the habitat quality and quantity, right? So maybe some habitats just have better resource availability. They're a higher quality habitat. They can sustain more individuals. Same with habitat quantity, all right? So if we have more areas for individuals to live, we can have more individuals, all right? Dispersal patterns will show us factors influencing population size, maybe migration patterns, and then the degree of habitat fragmentation. Right? So habitat fragmentation is where we have a habitat for whatever species we're looking at, and through something, all right, something is going to break that into two or more pieces. All right? So maybe that's taking a prairie and converting it into farmland. Right? So now there's farmland in the middle of two prairie sections. Right? That's a good example of habitat fragmentation. That has happened a lot in Minnesota's history. But there are multiple ways that we can fragment land. That can happen. A lot happens through human causes, but some of it can happen naturally. Think about maybe if we have a flood and it diverts a river, and now all of a sudden we have a river going through a habitat that was once whole. Right? So many different factors affecting population size. All right, and we can kind of look at how our populations are going to grow, thinking about those factors, but also thinking about births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. All right, so we have models that we can look at this. And so if we have exponential growth, all right, resources are not limiting. And let me actually put this on the slideshow here. All right, resources are not going to be a limiting factor. So for example, this wolf here has a lot of rabbits to choose between for prey. The resource of food is not a limiting factor. That wolf population can grow and grow and grow. Right? Resources are not limiting. Logistic growth, on the other hand, resources are limiting. Right? So the size of a population can only grow to the point that the environment can sustain it at. Right? So in this case, we have much fewer rabbits. This wolf population won't be able to grow quite as large. So when we look at the population growth model, we do have a little bit more math, all right? And for the purpose of this model here, I just want you to focus on that we are looking at a point in time. We're looking at the number of births. We're looking at the number of deaths, how many individuals are immigrating, and how many are emigrating, all right? Typically, we might assume that that population is closed, all right? So immigration equals emigration. We can kind of zero those out and focus only on births and deaths. All right, so we can kind of simplify this to be the change in individuals over the change of time equals the births minus the deaths. All right, so that's kind of a very simplistic population growth model. Now there's a lot of math associated with that to kind of come up with some other figures. I have decided to skip over these few slides, and I am not going to require you to know these. All right, because I want you to focus on what that math is going to tell us. All right, so essentially we can simplify that equation to say, or to look at our R value. All right, and our R value is simply the per capita birth rate. All right, so we're looking at the number of births per individual. All right, so we're looking at births minus deaths. So if we have an R greater than 0, the population increases. Less than 0, population decreases. Equal to 0, population stays the same. All right, so very similar to how we interpreted the net reproductive rate. All right, I put this up here because a lot of times on graphs you will see R equals some number. All right, and we're going to look at that in just a second. So for exponential growth, all right, again, resources are not limiting. All right, this population can basically keep on growing and growing and growing. Right, we can get to a point where that population just can't grow anymore. That R is at its maximum. All right, that would be in the intrinsic rate of increase. All right, often denoted as R max. So if we look at a table, or if we look at a graph here, right, we have two different populations. All right, they are both showing exponential growth rate because we have this kind of this J-shaped line on our graph where we see that resources are not limiting. The population is just getting larger and larger and larger. All right. Now for one population, R equals 1. The other population, R equals 0.5. So essentially, as we have higher R values, that population is going to grow more rapidly. All right. So this bold red line population is going to grow much faster than this population with an R of 0.5. It's going to grow a little slower. Now we see exponential growth rate happening a lot of times when we're reintroducing a species. So for a good example of that are wolves that were introduced into Yellowstone. Right? Once we introduced them, right, they had plenty of resources available to them. Resources were not limiting. We have seen exponential growth in their population over time. All right? So far, resources are not limiting that population's growth. Same with exotic species, right? So we might introduce an exotic species to an environment where it doesn't have any natural predators, or maybe it has a lot of resources available to it. Good example are these Burmese pythons in Florida, all right? So exotic species, they are not native to Florida. I don't remember how this happened, but I think there's some pets that were released and this population started to explode. All right, but if we plotted this population over time, we would see exponential growth. All right, resources are not limiting to these pythons. Human population growth is also a good example of exponential growth. All right, our population is growing exponentially. We have not hit a point yet where resources are stopping our population growth. All right, we fit that exponential pattern. And we can see that was pretty low, right, until we had the ability to domesticate animals and start developing agricultural practices. And from that point on, we have had this exponential growth. All right, so opposite of exponential growth, we have logistic growth. All right, so this is where resources are limiting. All right, and this is where we're going to see the term carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is basically the maximum population size that an environment can withstand. All right? So the environment has limited resources, and at some point that environment just can't sustain a population any bigger. That would be the carrying capacity, the upper boundary for the population. And again, I threw this equation up here. I don't expect you to know it, but know that carrying capacity factors into how we're going to get our numbers. All right, so logistic growth. The pattern is typically going to slow as we reach that carrying capacity. Now, this can depend on the environment that we're looking at. It can depend seasonally even, all right? The winter carrying capacity might be different than the summer carrying capacity. All right, so if we look at exponential versus logistical growth, all right, so we have our exponential growth. It's reaching our carrying capacity limit, all right? But for this population, that doesn't matter, all right? This population can keep growing. Resources are not defining its population size. But for this other population, we see as it's reaching that carrying capacity, all right, as it reaches to the point where the environment just can no longer sustain that number of individuals, that population is going to start to plateau out. All right, so kind of this curvy, slightly S-shaped figure here is very typical of an a logistic growth pattern. All right, and when we're looking at logistic growth, at first, all right, so if we cut off the very top of our graph here and just looked at the bottom, it might look exponential, all right, because resources are not limiting, right? But once the population grows to a point where there's so many individuals that now resources are become limiting, we'll see it start to plateau and becomes a logistic growth model. All right, so for the logistic growth model, big takeaway pictures. It is dependent on the environment. Once we get to carrying capacity, we are going to start to see a decrease in population, declining births, increasing deaths, all right, and that population growth is going to eventually stop. Many factors can influence this, all right, we kind of talked about a few, but food, maybe it's nutrients, nutrients especially for plants that can't move and have to stay in a single spot. Maybe it's areas of protection from predators, or maybe it's the number of nesting sites, right? So maybe we just can't find enough habitable space for that large population of birds. All right, so just to kind of recap, if I gave you a figure like this on the exam, I would expect you to know which one's exponential growth, which one is logistic growth. So take just a couple seconds, 30 seconds, figure out which is which, and we'll come back together. Yeah, we've gotten to the point where the environment just can't sustain a size any bigger.
Okay. And would it start to like make this shape then? Or would it be just a leveled out?
It would just start to level out. Right? It wouldn't necessarily decline unless maybe we have other factors influencing besides carrying capacity, but it's just going to level out. All right, so if we look at this chart, all right, this graph here, if I was looking at the red line, would that be exponential or logistic? I heard it, exponential. Yes, yes. We are not seeing anything level out. All right, resources are not limiting to this population. All right, so that means the blue line is what? Logistic. Yes, yes. Logistic, because we see that population is starting to plateau as we reach the carrying capacity. All right, the environment cannot sustain a population size any bigger than where it's leveling out as. All right, any questions on population dynamics? Alrighty, so let's move on to species interactions, which I think is a lot more fun to talk about. All right, so we've spent a lot of time talking about individuals, individual species and populations of species, but now we're going to start to look at the community level of ecology. All right, so when we're talking about the community level of ecology, we're talking about all the species that occur in any particular place. All right, so if we look at this image of the ocean down here, all right, we're looking at all the fish species, we're looking at all the plant species, we're looking at all the microscopic species, all right? We're looking at everything in that locality, right? Same with the zebras, all right? We're not just looking at the zebras, we're looking at the algae in the lake, we're looking at the plants on the stream side here, we're looking at the trees, all right? There's a lot going on. And we really want to know, so species, they might live in the same area, how do they interact with one another? There's a lot of different types of species interactions. We're going to briefly cover all of these here. All right, so if we look at these species interactions, depending on the interaction, it might be beneficial for both organisms, detrimental to both organisms, or one might benefit and one might not. All right, so competition, that is typically negative for both species. All right, so both species are vying for the same resources. None of them's particularly winning out. All right, they're both essentially losing. Predation, herbivory, parasitism, right? That typically is negative for one species, right? Maybe you're this species being predated upon, right? But it's going to be positive for the other. So for the predator, that's a very positive thing, all right? You're getting food. So for example, we have our rabbit here. It is preying on these plants, all right? The plants are negatively impacted, but the rabbit really likes to eat the grass, all right? They are positively impacted. We have mutualism, where both species benefit, and then commensalism, which is positive for one, doesn't really matter for the other. All right, so if we start by looking at competition, we have to look at different niches. All right, so a niche is the sum total of all ways a species utilizes the environment. All right, so for you guys in this classroom here, your niche might be the Gustavus Adolphus College. All right, it's providing you space, it's providing you food, it's providing you housing. That is your niche at this particular point in time. Now, competition comes into play where we have individuals where their niches start to overlap one another. All right, so the analogy I'm going to make are students versus faculty. All right, I don't want to pit us against each other, but we are competing for, say, food in the cafeteria. All right, so if our niches overlap in the caf, we might be competing for that last slice of pizza, for example. All right, so competition is going to occur when our niches start to overlap for some type of resource. It might not be every resource, right? It might only be one resource. But as long as there's overlap, there's going to be competition.
What was your go-to dinner when you were in school?
Go-to dinner? Ooh, I like that Caesar salad they have. All right, so competition. Intraspecific competition, all right, is competition between individuals of the same species. All right, you're in the same species, you're in the same population, you both need to eat food, all right, you're going to compete with one another. All right, so in this classroom, you might both be competing for that last slice of pizza or that last Caesar salad bowl, whatever it might be in the cafeteria. That's typically a density-dependent factor that limits growth in populations. Right? So the higher the population, the more competition for that last slice of pizza. All right, so a good example of competition is this researcher that worked with these Paramecium species. All right, so he looked at these 3 different species, all right, and independently, on their own, they grew logistically. All right, so we see they had high growth rates until resources became limiting, and they plateaued out. All right, now he put them in competition with one another. All right, so he put this red species with the green species here. I am not going to attempt to say their full names, but once he pitted them against each other, we saw that one species was able to thrive, the other one died out. All right, so this is a good example of competitive exclusion, right, where one species wins out over the other. But if we looked at the other 2 species of Paramecium, all right, this green species and this blue species, when he grew them together, he saw that both of them still coexisted together. All right, neither one of them went extinct in that population. All right, this would be an example of coexistence. All right, so the resources that was needed by the green species and that was needed by the blue species didn't overlap enough for one to outcompete another. All right, so kind of our 2 outcomes of competition is either going to be competitive exclusion or coexistence. Right? Either one species is going to win out over the other, or the resources are going to be partitioned up in a way that 2 species can coexist with one another. All right, so we get that competitive exclusion principles. 2 species cannot coexist indefinitely on the same limiting resource. One is going to win out over the other in the long run. Now, the outcome of competitive interactions is really going to be influenced by the environment. All right, maybe it's the physical environment. You might be competing for hiding places from predators. Maybe you're competing for burrows, food and nutrient availability, and if there's any predators present. Right? So there's multiple things that can lead to competition, not just competition for food, which is what we generally think about. Right, so a good example of resource partitioning, and we've used this example in the past with the warblers, right, is this researcher, he studied 5 different warblers and noticed that they occupy different regions within the same tree. All right, so they are coexisting in the same environment, but they're living in different regions. Right, they have different niches. Right, so some of them might live more in the interior, some of them might live on the exterior. All right, and depending on where they live, they probably fed on different ranges of insects, so they were able to partition out those resources enough where they could coexist with one another. All right, competition is common. All right, so resource partitioning, that's also common, but competition, if we're overlapping in any part of our niche, is very common. In fact, when species use the same resource, competition is almost always reported. 90% of the time. All right, so plants especially show a high degree of competition. All right, so if you think about a plant, they just can't get up and move to another area. They are stationary. Whatever they have there is all that they are ever going to have. They really have to compete for those resources. Those resources are typically going to be water. They're going to be nutrients in the soil. It could be light. All right, so think about plants that grow taller than others. They are outcompeting each other for light, for photosynthesis. And we also see marine animals tend to compete a little bit more than terrestrial animals. Right? Again, their resources are limiting. They can't just jump out of the water or go to another pond or go to another sea. All right? They are stuck where they are. Now, when we have competition between different species, this would be intraspecific competition. All right? So competition between the ant and the beetle, or the beetle and the mouse. We see that their niches are overlapping. Right? There is competition occurring. Intraspecific competition because they are different species. All right, so I wanted to step back and have you kind of Google your own example of competition. Right? Find some sort of competition for food, resources, territory, and answer those 2 questions about competition. Yeah, we might compete for resources. It depends on what aspect of human life you're looking at.
Well, I don't know. I guess one could argue that we don't need any of the stuff that we're getting. We don't. Like the rainforest.
Okay, okay.
I'm just trying to think of one that I can think of.
Yes, yes. Let's try thinking more like basic needs almost. That might make it easier. But yes, you're right. There are some competition with other species that is unnecessary.
Yeah.
Yes. Let me see here. I wrote it down because I get these mixed up. Inter is the same. Intra is different. And you know what? Let me just make sure. I want to just make sure I wrote that down correct too, because I was writing off the notes.
Wrong, can I know because I already typed it?
Yes, I will let you know. No, I had it backwards.
Uh-oh.
I know. Shame on me.
We all get extra points on the final.
I did not study this one enough, huh? Inter and intra. Those are
Inter
two.
is between the same intras outside.
Inter is between 2 different species.
Ah!
Yes.
Okay.
And I will fix that on the slides.
Intra is between 2 of the same. Inter is like.
Yeah.
outside.
Intra
Trying to think of a good way to
I
remember
know.
that.
Wait, intra competition is the same?
Same. Yes.
It
Yes.
says competition between individuals of the same species.
I think I had it wrong on
Yeah,
at least one slide.
It's different?
Did you not? You literally said if you have it wrong, tell me.
Okay, but so it's different.
Yes.
Okay.
I wrote intra twice. Whereas on this slide, I should have wrote inter. All right, so I had a typo. All right, so yes, inter, different species, intra, same species. All right, I know that's confusing, and I even mix them up, as is obvious by my slides. I will make sure to fix the student version of these slides so that when you're going back and looking at it, it will not confuse you. So thank you for letting me know. So did we come up with an example? Anybody have an example of competition? There's a lot of examples out there.
I know, I should.
Who wants to volunteer theirs? All right, let's see here.
That's actually really funny.
So if we are both competing for land to live on, humans are competing for land to live on, is that inter or intra-specific? Intra, same species, yep, and we're competing for land. All right, let's see, is that an example of coexistence or of competitive exclusion?
Wait, intro is the same.
Intra is the same. Yeah.
Why?
So if we're competing for land, are we excluding the other or are we coexisting with the other?
You're excluding the other. Actually,
It could go either way for humans, right? Humans are a complex species.
yeah.
I would say we're excluding,
Yeah.
all right? Especially in America where we consider we have rights over our land, all right? We're excluding others from inhabiting that land. What about, if anybody else wants to offer up an example? All right, lions and hyenas. All right, is that inter or intra-specific competition? Inter, yes, two different species. All right, so lions are eating the hyenas. Is that coexistence or competitive exclusion? Any ideas? I would say it's coexistence, right? Even though we're predating on the other, the populations are still surviving, right? The lions are not depleting that hyena population to extinction, right? They're not going to eat out the entire population because then they won't have food in the future, right? So they're essentially coexisting with one another to the detriment of a few individuals. All right, let's move on and talk about predation, herbivory, and parasitism. All right. So if we look at these three categories of, I would say competition, we can look at how lethal they are and the length of association. Right. So if we look at this lion, all right, lion predating on hyenas, right, that's pretty lethal. Right, that hyena is going to be killed. All right, and it typically does not take that lion very long to kill that hyena. All right, so very lethal, does not need to interact with the hyenas for very long. Versus, say, a tick, all right, maybe it's a wood tick we might find here in Minnesota. It's found its host living on the deer. All right, that wood tick is probably going to coexist on that deer for quite a long time. All right, but the lethality of that's typically pretty low. All right, the deer is not going to fall over and die unless some disease is being transferred, right? All right, so we can look at how lethal they are and how long they interact with one another. Now, because we have all these different means of dying and being predated upon and parasitoids, we have evolved many defenses to try to outsmart our competition, right? Outsmart our natural enemies. So that we have a lot of different anti-predator defenses that we can look at. So if we start by looking at some examples of chemical and mechanical defenses, right? I think these are super interesting and super fun to look at examples. So we have this bombardier beetle. This actually ejects hot spray at its attacker. Acid. All right. It is ejecting acid. I did not know that about the beetle. Makes sense, right? If you get hit in the face with acid, you probably don't want to eat that beetle, right? Different type of coloration, say, such as aposematic coloration, such as these poison dart frogs here. They're kind of warning their predators that, hey, if you eat me, I'm not going to taste good, all right? Or if you eat me, I'm going to be lethal because I have poison on my skin, all right? So different coloring is different defenses. In plants, secondary metabolites are really common. A good example of that is latex, right? So in milkweed, for example, it has latex in it. If herbivores eat too much of this latex, unless they've developed some sort of resistance, they can go into cardiac glycosis. It eventually affects the heart function in vertebrates. All right, so it's going to affect your heart function if you eat too much latex. All right, that's a good defense that plants have, especially if you're a smaller animal. You don't have to eat as much to have that lethality. Camouflage is a really interesting one. All right, so I love octopuses. All right, and I think they're so cool and incredibly smart. Right, they have the ability to camouflage in with the seafloor so well. All right, so think about those cryptic morphs of those paper chips that we looked at. We looked at camouflage. Same with these seahorses. They blend in very well. Right? I always, when I'm online, doom scrolling through whatever social media, every now and then I'll come up with an image of I got so close to this predator or this snake and I didn't even realize it because the camouflage was so great. And you spend like 10 minutes trying to find that snake in that picture, right? Snakes are really good examples of having great camouflage, right? They can really blend in with their environment. All right, mimicry is another type of anti-predator defense. We can have Müllerian mimicry, all right, where if you are a noxious species, right, you are a toxic species to eat, different species will have similar coloration to really emphasize the fact that do not eat me, I am toxic. All right, so even though they're different species, they have evolved similar color patterns. Bytesian mimicry, this is where one species might actually be edible, right? You could eat that species, but it's mimicking the colors of the toxic species, all right? It's trying a way to fool the predator and saying, hey, you don't want to eat me, I could be toxic, but actually it would be quite fine, all right? So coral snakes are a good example of a toxic animal that has lots of mimics. I wanted to give you another example of this Müllerian mimicry, all right? So bees are a good example of that. Right? If we look at bees, they all kind of have that same coloration, or these wasps, these bees, these yellow jackets, they all tend to be yellow and black, right? Even though they have evolved differently, all right? They tend to mimic one another to kind of reinforce that warning pattern to any predators in that area. Displays of intimidation, right? I think this photo up here is hilarious of this owl intimidating the cat. All right, but basically you're making yourself look bigger. All right, you want to puff up like the porcupine fish here, make yourself look bigger, and basically say to that predator, hey, don't try to mess with me. I'm gonna beat you up or come at you or whatever it wants to get across. And then armor and weaponry. All right, so turtle shells, good example. Beetle exoskeleton, different horns and antlers to fight off different predators. I think a good example for plants is the honey locust tree. All right, so the honey locust tree has all these big spines on its trunk. Right? It actually evolved those spines to deter woolly mammoths from eating too many of its fruit. All right, so this is an old species. Obviously, the woolly mammoths have died out now, but they still retain some of their spines, especially if you get a native species and not a cultivar. All right, so predators have major effects. And if we introduce a species that does not have a predator, we can see this explosion in numbers. Right, again, those Burmese pythons in Florida, they don't have a natural predator there, right? So they're gonna basically increase and increase and increase in their population, gonna have a major effect on wildlife. All right, so they're going to eat raccoons, possums, they can affect white-tailed deer, bobcats, all throughout the food chain, right? If they're taking away the smallest predators, other animals in that area cannot also predate upon them, right? So they're going to have a huge effect on the wildlife there. In fact, I believe they hold these annual hunts where they try to kill as many pythons as they can to kind of help control that population. Another good example that happened in Australia is the prickly pear cactus. All right, so this cacti was introduced to Australia, quickly adapted to life there, kind of exploded in its range, took over farmland, took over pastures to the point where cows couldn't graze very easily, all right, became a major pest. And finally, we introduced a small cactus moth that fed on the cactus. All right, so we introduced a predator to this plant in order to to alleviate some of this pressure from this invasive species. All right, so eventually, we cleared hundreds of thousands of hectares of cacti, and we were able to let the sheep graze again, and able to let the farmers have their livelihood back. So, what's another example of a species interaction affecting our society?
Those stupid things where you and all gotta check the back of your bowl before you pull it out.
What?
Okay. Like mussels.
The back of what?
No, that's a weed.
Oh.
In Wisconsin, it's like some seaweed, there's algae or something.
No, it's.
Okay.
You take your boat off, you gotta like go in with a brush and whack it all back into the lake.
Yeah. So invasive species, yeah, they can be annoying for us. They affect our everyday life because we have to be careful not to spread them. All right, what might be some other examples?
The tree hogs.
Oh yeah, the gypsy moth.
What was that?
Squirrels chewing on power lines.
Squirrels chewing on power lines. Yes, that is very annoying and is affecting our society. The gypsy moth on trees. Same with what is the Dutch elm disease coming through? All right.
The emerald ash borer.
Emerald ash borer.
That's the one I was
Yeah, we can get a lot of different species coming through and taking out things that we take for granted.
What about the deer disease?
The deer disease. I know what you're talking about. I can't think of the name.
What,
I
Lyme
keep
disease?
thinking HIV, but that's definitely
Something that makes the deer
Yeah.
unedible for
Or
us.
if you kill it, you guys are poisoned, yeah.
Yeah, yep. So there's many ways that we're interacting with our environment, right? We're not a closed-off society. One of the last two things I wanted to mention is mutualisms. All right, so this is where both parties benefit. Pollinators, great example of this. All right, the bees, they get pollen to make honey. The plants, they get pollinated and fertilized so they can make more offspring. Commensalism, this is where one member benefits and the other it really has no effect, maybe a mild annoyance in the case of this dog here. All right, so a good example are seeds that have these barbs on them. They'll attach to different animals and be spread across that animal's range. Doesn't really harm the animal, all right? It might be a nuisance to them at some point, but it's really nothing to them, all right? But for the plants, major benefit, all right? They get much larger dispersal than they could have tried to get on their own, all right? Remember, plants don't move, so they have to find ways to move their seeds without them. All right, so last kind of concept I wanted to go over is this density dependence. All right, so if we have a density dependent factor, right, mortality factors are going to vary with population density. So mortality high here, population is high on this end. We look at a density independent factor here, density dependent, sorry. As our population increases in size, mortality is also going to increase. Right? So a good example is parasitism, predation, competition, what we're experiencing now with COVID. All right, we know that COVID spreads quickly in denser populated areas, right? That's why we have our 6-foot distance, social distancing that we want to do. Because we know if we pack a bunch of humans close together in a room with COVID, it'll probably spread pretty fast, right? So that would be a density dependent example. Density independent factor is a mortality factor that doesn't really, is not really influenced by population size. All right, so that might be weather, drought, flood, fire. All right, if we have a major freeze overnight, doesn't matter how many plants are in that freeze zone, they're all going to die about the same. All right, there's only 2 plants, maybe only those 2 plants died. If there are 50 plants, maybe all 50 plants died. Does not matter the population size. And then an inverse density dependent factor is something that is going to decrease population density, or it's going to decrease mortality without increasing density. I think I said that right. All right, a good example of this, an example will help you understand this, is if the lion kills the same number of prey over and over and over, right? It doesn't matter how many prey are within its range, it's always going to kill, say, 2, right? It just so happens if that the population of hyenas that it's preying upon is small, that 2 is going to make more of a difference than if that population of hyenas was larger. All right, that would be an inverse density dependent factor. All right, We got through our lecture and we are officially back on track. All right. So for Friday, we do have that quiz, but remember, it's online. You can use your notes if you'd like. It's hopefully should be a nice, easy points for you.
What if Corey lives down the hall from me?
What was that?
What if Corey lives down the hall from me? Can I do my quiz down the hall?
I would say don't work with each other.
We just happen to be in the same room.
Don't collaborate with one another. You could study with one another and use your notes, but don't work with one another while taking the quiz.